Welcome back to Your Voice, Your Future on this Monday, May 20th. We're happy to have our CIA operative on some disclosed location from around the world join us, as well as Carrie Sheffield, who's a senior fellow at the Independence Women's Forum. Mr. Operative, you know, the strange thing about the death of Iran's President Raisi is that you have people who are mourning, but you also having those who are overwhelmingly celebrating also. Help us understand these images that are emanating out of Iran.
All over social media from Iran, they're shooting off fireworks. People are excited. There's videos of people opening champagne, which they're not supposed to have, and drinking and celebrating the death of both of these guys. The people of the country, the young people in specifically, are relieved the same way they were when Qasem Soleimani was killed. They were happy because these are the oppressors of the youth of the country.
You know, I don't know if people realize it or not, that 50% of the population in Iran is under 37 years of age. And when Trump took out Soleimani, they consolidate the power center there in Iran with Raisi and the foreign minister. And Iran really doesn't have any succession plan in place. But do you think that this could temper the conflict in the Middle East and also find an opportunity to find some kind of resolution with the Hamas in Israel, given the fact that both the president and the foreign minister were just two of the biggest advocates of this conflict and keeping it in this reign of terror? Could anything change there if the United States plays its hand well in the light of the death that recently occurred?
It certainly could. The interesting thing about Raisi was he was a fast-tracked young man as he worked his way up through the system, but he came through the justice system. He was part of the prosecution of thousands of people inside the country as he worked his way up through the justice process inside Iran. So his name is well known, although he may not be well known to Americans. His name is very well known to people that live inside Iran. And this team, these two people, were prominent figures in whatever comes in the near future of Iran if they transition to another government. The polarization inside the country can happen at any time between the three major players inside the country. And the Ayatollah has always been the oldest, and people would expect him to be the first to go, but an incident like this has disrupted any type of initial planning on how to put together the next wave of government if you have a big change. And an overreaction by Iran against any kind of demonstrations could very easily lead to another insurgent uprising of the youth. I mean, the people in Iran are upset, and the merchant class is the piece to keep your eye closest on, because when they've had enough, that's when you're going to see widespread trouble inside the country that the regime may not be able to put down.
You know, Carrie, it's fascinating watching initially how the Iranians and the terrorists were trying to blame the death of Raisi on Israel. And it is obvious the Turkey government was able to capture the footage 3 minutes before the aircraft went down, and that when it gone down, they had no visibility within 50 feet. It's obvious that this is due to nature. Why these powerful figures think that they're more special going into this kind of weather terrain. I mean, did we not learn anything from Kobe Bryant where you think you have this power? And obviously, you know, the pilots probably told him this was not wise, but you know, when you're dealing with a dictator, they have to do what they're told. But how do you think this is going to play out in terms of, it's a shockwave in Iran. It's not something that they could ever plan for. And what do we know about his vice president, who just became the acting president, and now they have 50 days between now to vote for the new leadership?
Yeah, you're right. And I'm from Missouri, and Mel Carnahan was a famous politician who, governor and I believe senator, and he was killed in a small plane crash. You see it happening in these kind of small alternative forms of transportation. It's not uncommon for celebrities or politicians. Unfortunately, it's sad. Um, I think the interesting thing to watch is, yes, will there be more uprisings? It seems like every few years now we have an uprising of the young people of Iran, but you're seeing them tightening the noose a bit more to try to crack down with the morality police. And so I think you're going to continue to see that, unfortunately, especially for the women there. That was something that to see, recently this young woman who was murdered because she didn't have her job perfectly, and the women of Iran to rise up and to maybe see some loosening of some rights for them, but only to take it right back, which is the classic sign of abuser. So I pray for the people of Iran. I don't think it's right to rejoice in someone's death, even if it was a dictator and a murderous one at that. I think it's he will answer to God for everything he's done. I think Israel, will.
We're having some audio issues here. I didn't hear a word you said, Carrie, so forgive us. Let me go back to Mr. Operative. Israel and Palestine, Mr. Operative, given the long-standing conflict between Israel and Palestine, what are the most critical steps that need to be taken going forward? And how could this situation work when you deal with the international community? What road should it take to foster this sustainable peace agreement in the region, if this is at all possible?
The biggest step has to be the complete destruction of the Hamas leadership system so that they can't direct activities on the ground inside of Gaza. The Palestinian Authority is forced to take responsibility for all of the Palestinians that are inside what are the current borders of that area. Then you've got a centralized authority that then is responsible for what goes on in the area. But you can't do that until Hamas is weakened enough that they can be silenced and pushed out of the way. It's going to be a difficult balancing act for a while to see how much can get done with Iran completely distracted at the moment. If there's a flare-up of activity inside of Hamas, one of their biggest advantages is having the propaganda machinery operating at full speed. The Iranians are going to be distracted internally for the next 50 days, and especially as they go through the recovery period of getting everybody back to Iran and arranging funerals. There's going to be time inside Iran where they're not going to be focused on Hamas or anything going on outside as they organize themselves to try and transition peacefully and under control into a new government. This is a tenuous time for them. It's not, these type regimes are not, they don't do well with surprises, and this was a total surprise and a dangerous surprise for them.
It's interesting, Mr. Operative, because China today introduced a robot dog armed with machine guns. I would assume our country has the same, but should we be concerned?
It's something to certainly think about with China because of their mass production capability. But mechanical soldiers, it's been a science fiction topic for quite some time with different movies that have come out. But the fact is, human brains are an essential component of human behavior. And you can have large numbers of drones or large numbers of robots or whatever your AI tool is at the time, but they still have to be operated and controlled by human beings. That's an inexact science at best at this point in our activities worldwide. It's dangerous to do this. It's provocative and it's reckless.
You know, Carrie, China and Russia, with the growing geopolitical influence of China and Russia, how do you assess their current strategies in expanding their spheres of influence, and what implications do these have for the U.S. foreign policy going forward, Carrie?
Oh, there are huge implications. I mean, that's one of the biggest geopolitical shifts with the invasion of Ukraine was that China was the saving grace for Russia. China is basically the reason why Russia didn't completely collapse after we had the sanctions, all the Western nations coming together to sanction Russia, and China dragging its feet as much as possible, and then also evading them and also supplying them with weapons and purchasing their oil that the European markets didn't want to buy, and other energy supplies. So this is unfortunately a newly forged romance, because there had been such a rivalry between these two countries for so long. I think it's unfortunate. That's again, to me, another outgrowth of the weakness of Joe Biden, because Joe Biden, it all started with the botched withdrawal of Afghanistan. Vladimir Putin was watching, and he saw the weakness of Joe Biden, how he fumbled it, how he left $80 billion of equipment, how American lives were lost, how there was no repercussion for this, for the Taliban coming in and taking over the country. And so that emboldened Putin. The weakness of Biden emboldened Putin to go in and try to seize all of Ukraine. And the fact that the West did come together, that's to their credit. However, I truly believe it is not a coincidence that if you look at the last four presidents, in 2008, there was an invasion of the sovereign, Georgia by Russia under George W. Bush. There was under Obama, there was the invasion of Crimea, and there was nothing under Trump. And now we have this of Ukraine. So I do believe if Trump was still in office, we would not have seen the Ukrainian invasion. And the hope is that if Trump wins again, he will be able to provide that strength. As Ronald Reagan would say, peace through strength.
Mr. Operative, you have the final word before we say goodbye to you and Carrie. What advice would you give to Israel and Netanyahu in light of the tragic loss of life of the president and his foreign minister and 7 other people on board that helicopter?
I wouldn't give Netanyahu any advice on dealing with a terrorist attack and an operational activity like they have underway. If we had the last 22 years of success in our adventuring overseas, I would certainly still not do it, but we have no business telling him what we want him to do or what we think he should do and trying to force that position. Think about the reverse of that. If the Israelis had stuck their nose into what we were doing after 9/11, it would not have been well received by the population or by the government. We should support our agreements that we have with them and not withhold things. This is their neighborhood, and they have to live in it when it's over. And this was an atrocious event that needs a final solution answer. You cannot continue with Hamas. They are a benevolent actor. They will never act any differently, and they should be stamped out. And the Israelis know what they're doing, and they know how to do this. And now Hamas gave them an opportunity for them to unleash on them in a very broad way, an unconventional way, and they are doing it. And Hamas, the louder they squeal, the more pressure they have, because they are afraid of being snuffed out as an entity.
And we all can understand that. Mr. Operative, thank you. Carrie Sheffield, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll be back. Nathan Worcester is the national political reporter at the Epoch Times, and Lawrence Wilson also cover politics, and we welcome you both to the broadcast. Let me start with you, Nathan. How damaging was Michael Cohen admitting that he stole $30,000 from the Trump organization was to the prosecution's trial?
You know, I think that looking at the big picture of the impact of these trials, it's been a little difficult to say, at least from the political standpoint, what the result will be. So far, my perception has been that the very notion that Trump is being prosecuted the way that he is, kind of irrespective of the details, has been enough to have Republican voters rally around the flag, which we saw last year during the primary season. I think the big question is, how is this going to play with independents who may be on the fence? My instinct is that at this point, I think any independent who, based upon anything in these trials, would be less likely to vote for Trump has probably already made that decision not to go with him, and vice versa. Those who see something that make them more sympathetic to Trump, you know, they're probably already decided on that.
Nathan, the issue is, how does it play with the jury?
Okay. Well, I have to say I have not been following that case or the legal details closely. I've really been paying attention to the political scene, the 2024 presidential race, and some of the Senate and House races. So that's what I could speak to more confidently.
Why do you think Biden has a record low approval rating when it comes to the handling of the Israel-Gaza conflict? It's at an all-time low of 36%, and he has overwhelmingly lost the vote which he relied on to put him in the White House. The younger generation, they've abandoned him. What do you make of this, and what do you attribute it to?
It really is a remarkable phenomenon. You look at the base of support, both the vote, the financial backing, various aspects of both Biden and Trump, and they both have generally been historically, you know, you look at Biden as a senator, you look at Trump as a president, they've been pretty consistently pro-Israel. And yet at the same time, you look at the way that Biden has attempted to negotiate with aspects of his base, with parts of the party who are more vociferous now than they were even a few years ago. And it can seem as though he's trying to find a compromise on some of these issues that just doesn't exist. On the other hand, Trump, being in many cases widely perceived as the most pro-Israel president in history, despite the fact generation is far more sympathetic to Palestine than to Israel relative to the older generation, they are going with Trump. I think a lot of the perception that Trump is the anti-war candidate. I keep having these conversations with voters, especially young people, young men who are worried about potentially having to serve. They, I think, perceive that, and that makes a state like Michigan especially interesting, where there's a, large Arab Christian and Arab Muslim population that feels very discouraged by, but at the same time, you have a unique level of loyalty to Trump that is coming forth that has been pretty much unprecedented among Republicans, with a lot of the base that was formerly locked up on the Democratic side.
Let me, Nathan, what states do you think are in play? I know you've seen the polls where the New York Times and CNN have said that Trump is winning in the battleground states. But what states are in play? Let's say states like Minnesota and Virginia and other states that are up in the air. And also, we're many months from the general election. How do you see this playing out statewide, nationwide?
That's a good question. What makes Trump such a unique figure is that, like a few presidents before him, I could say Obama, Reagan, these are people who in some ways they transcended party. You had someone like Reagan was able to draw in Democrats. You had someone like Obama was able to draw in Republicans. In Trump's case, though, that means you look at some of these states where he is very competitive. Nevada, for example, he's way out ahead. But then some of the important Senate and House races that are happening there, it's not as obvious that those candidates are going to benefit down ticket. I'm not saying that they won't, but as compared to a candidate who's more seen as a party man, like Biden, for example. So I'm looking at the states you just mentioned, Virginia, but I'm also looking at some states where I think Republicans have some vulnerabilities that have not been reported to the extent that you would think. In North Carolina, for example, which is a battleground state that has trended towards Republicans. Republicans have a registration advantage there. The House and the Senate, they've got enough power. I believe they have supermajorities in both or something close to it. In suburban Charlotte, North Carolina, in one of these areas that's about evenly split between Democrats and Republicans, I was at a polling place during early voting where there were 2 Democrats to 1 Republican. And this is a consistent theme that I hear across the country, is that the Republicans, when it comes to the ground game, when it comes to the organization, they're behind the Democrats. So they're very behind the 8 ball. You talk to Turning Point Action, which is working on early voting. You talk to other organizations on the conservative side, they will agree that this is a persistent issue. So I kind of, at the same time, I think some of these states may be in play for Trump. I think because of that ground game gap, we may see some strange outcomes, maybe things down ticket that don't look a lot like what could be a stronger Trump sweep across the country.
Lawrence Wilson, talk about the Electoral College and the fact that there's a movement to say that we should move away from it. Just how do you think the Electoral College, obviously it plays huge in these elections, but talk about the Electoral College now and in the future.
Well, the Electoral College isn't going anywhere anytime soon. There are usually some rumblings about the Electoral College when you have, as we've had a number of times in the past, 2 decades, where you have a popular election candidate who comes in second but wins in the Electoral College. But what the Electoral College is doing is exactly what it was designed to do, is to ensure that all states have some equal representation regardless of population. It functions in a way the same way as the Senate does. Every state gets 2 senators regardless of the population. And in the Electoral College, the states get a certain number of votes. It's based on population, but it's a certain number of votes and it's limited. And so it's a way of equalizing the power of states. So a smaller state can have an effect on a presidential election, even though they don't have the 35 or 38 million people that California has. So the Electoral College kind of has that leavening effect. It always makes people upset who feel like they are in the majority, but not in terms of the number of electoral votes. And it's always a comfort to people from often smaller states who do get to have an important say in a presidential election, even though they may be middle of the road in terms of population. So I don't think the Electoral College is going anywhere. It's a fixture of our political landscape, and it's been a part of the institution of the presidency and of our electing of presidents since the beginning of the country.
Let me ask you something very simple, Lawrence. When you think about key issues in this presidential election year, how are issues like jobs, crime, and just keeping the lights on is going to impact this election on Election Day, Lawrence?
Well, I think the economy is going to be a large impact on the election, and that's going to be felt more, and it's going to be a voting issue more for people who are on the lower end of the economic scale. I've heard economists talk about, and I've seen the numbers that show that there really are a group of Americans who, despite the inflation, they're still doing okay. They've got their bills paid, they're paying their mortgage, their income is rising, but you have an awful lot of people who are on the lower half of the economic spectrum, and that's who's getting getting hit hard by these price increases. You look at the fact that cost of some fast food items has doubled or more. That impacts people who are working for a living, and they're eating out because they don't have meals prepared at home, or they're working a lot. They don't have time to do that. They're getting hammered by this. So they're going to vote on it. But it's not equal across the board.
Talk about the important role, Lawrence, that you think abortion is going to play in the 2024 election.
Well, it is going to be a factor. And in my estimation so far, it looks like it's going to be a factor at the state level and not necessarily, certainly in the presidential race, not as big an impact. Now, access to abortion is on the ballot in Arizona, in Florida, in Maryland, in New York, and there are 6 other states which could put abortion-related initiatives on the ballot yet for this fall election. So voters in states like Arizona and Florida are going to be highly motivated to come out and vote because of those abortion-related initiatives. Also, this is going to have an impact in a number of states at the level of the state legislature, because you have states that have or have been considering more restrictive legislation on abortion. And now that President Trump has made it clear that he's not going to make this a federal issue if elected, it's going to be left to the states. That's going to be a real battleground issue in a lot of states.
This is Your Voice, Your Future. I'm Armstrong Williams, and we'll be back.
It is easier to build up strong children than to try and repair broken men.
The streets are plagued with crime, violence. There's a lot of poverty, and it's all a result of lack of education that's happening in our schools. So it really is a crisis.
We come from very different political perspectives, but we've come to the same conclusion, and that is there is a crisis in the classroom. Children are being deprived of quality of life because they're being deprived of a good education. We must solve this problem. It's incumbent upon all of us to join hands together to get this done.
We can't afford to wait one more day before we address these issues, because every day we lose another child.
Let's stop the politicking. Let's stop the games. Let's really do something to give these kids a real chance at life and being a part of that American dream.
We need accountability for funding. Many of the districts where you're seeing very low test scores, students graduating with very low literacy and math comprehension rates, they are receiving a lot of funding. So where is the money going where our kids aren't being adequately educated?
If you believe every child is deserving of a quality education, please go to educationjusticefoundation.com. And Tiffany Justice is joining us now. You know, Tiffany, what is fascinating is that 63% of Republicans are very enthusiastic about this election, and only 36% of Democrats are enthusiastic. What do you attribute the enthusiasm level to when you look at these numbers that are coming out about who's more enthusiastic about going out to vote?
I think polls are just predictors. Polls change every day of the week. If you look at one poll, it may say that Democrats are more enthusiastic than Republicans. Some polls may say that Republicans are more enthusiastic. I think that one of the the factors that people are concerned about in the Democratic Party is Biden's age, is that the fact that he is 80, 81 years old. And if he is reelected, that he will be 86 years old. And we can clearly see that there are some that Biden is slowing down a little bit. So Biden has assured the American people that he is strong enough to carry this nation if he's elected for 4 more years. But that is a genuine concern, especially on a college campus. When I talk to my students, that is one of the major concerns that they have about Biden is his age. Will he be able to fulfill his role as the president?
How big of a role do you think that the protests that you're seeing across college campuses are going to have on how young people vote, Tiffany, Lloyd, this election year?
I think that the protests are going to be very strong. As a matter of fact, yesterday at Morehouse College, the valedictorian called for a ceasefire in front of the President of the United States. President Biden was the commencement speaker for Morehouse College. A lot of the college students that have graduated, while they may have appreciated the experience at the college campus, but they're disappointed. They've lost faith. They didn't feel as if the college or the university heard them. They don't feel that they are being heard in America. So I think that these college protests, what we're seeing right now unfolding on national television, is going to have a major impact on the elections.
Let me go back to, I know we've lost Lawrence for a minute. Nathan, how important will the issue of immigration play in this year's election?
It's probably the most important issue. This election is a referendum on what I think we could say is one of the most radical changes on any policy in the modern era. You look at some issues, China, for example, the tariff policy that Trump put in place, despite all the criticism that it was a trade war that it got from the media, Biden has maintained that, and it arguably has intensified that. When he took office, though, you speak to people, you speak to Border Patrol officers, there was a massive surge. There was something titanic that happened that has continued to play out with some interruptions based in part upon bilateral negotiations between the U.S. and Mexico, and also things happening with the cartels in Mexico. Every American across the country, when you say that every state is a border state, everybody I speak to, they're seeing the effects. They're seeing social services being strained. They're seeing, in the case of Chicago, where I'm from, people, families, small children out on the streets. And so you look at the poll numbers around immigration, around illegal immigration in particular, and the border. This is I would say, an issue where the Republicans, by highlighting it, can only stand to benefit. So, for example, in Arizona, even as Lawrence pointed out, they have an abortion-related initiative on the ballot. They also now are having an immigration-related issue, which is, right now, almost certain to benefit Republicans. You look at what independent voters care about, they tend to match more closely with the Republican issues. The top issues for Republicans tend to be the economy and the border, as compared to, abortion, for example, tends to be a bigger factor on the Democratic side. This is, just to reiterate, I think if we don't see a major effect from the border on the outcome of this election, at least in some battleground states, I would be very, very surprised.
Tiffany, Lloyd, how important is the issue of health care and prescription drugs?
That issue is very important. Here's the thing. We live in the United States of America, the greatest country in the world, where we say life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We cannot guarantee our children a quality education. We cannot guarantee our children a roof over their head. We cannot guarantee our children health care. We cannot guarantee our children a place to lay their head at night, but we can guarantee them a jail cell if they mess up. I think that health care is very important. Every American should have health care. And so when we think about this election, health care is one of the things that are at the top of the list with the Democratic Party.
You said something that's fascinating, though. It seems as though that no matter who's elected, whether it's a Republican, a Democrat, very little changes for the underclass, very little changes for people who live in poverty, very little changes for people who struggle. People come around, they make these promises, promises after promises, and yet nothing changes. Why, Tiffany?
You know, because here's the thing. A lot of politicians are like car salesmen. They'll tell you what you want to hear just to get you to buy in, and then you don't hear from them anymore. You know, one of the most popular places during election time, believe it or not, it is the church. The church is the most popular place. Every politician wants to get a photo op with the pastor, with the preacher, or what have you, because they know that the church and the pastor has a major influence on their congregation. And so I think that it is time for, here's the beauty about us in America. We have the power to vote people in, and we have the power to vote people out. But the reason why we keep having politicians that keep failing us is because it's our fault. We keep putting them back in. And that's why it's so important for us to be mindful of the people that we have out there that are representing us, to educate ourselves and to go out and vote. You don't have a voice if you don't go out and vote. There's no need to complain about anything if you choose not to exercise your right and vote.
Lawrence, how big is judges and the Supreme Court? Nathan, I know. I mean, listen, forgive me. There's so many voices in my head tonight. It's an interesting night. I've never had a night like this before on TV. But you know what? We get through it, right? So let me come back to you, Nathan. The importance of people voting for the judges and the Supreme Court.
You mean when the president, depending upon who's elected president, their effect on the Supreme Court?
Oh, yeah, and judges. Oh, yes.
Yeah, it's interesting to consider just how big of a change the president can have on the composition of the Supreme Court and on the composition of the lower federal courts as well, which those end up being feeders to the Supreme Court. You could argue that one of the biggest changes we've seen over the past several decades is a big, more comprehensive turn towards originalism, towards what proponents of that philosophy would argue as fidelity to the Constitution. You know, with Clarence Thomas, Samuel Alito, various other judges now who are poised to become the face of the Supreme Court in the future. This is a pretty marked change from the living constitutionalism of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and also the precedent that was set earlier in the 20th century with a court that, at the same time that the court is a political football on one side, it at another time was a political football on the other side. I think that we could be poised if Biden is reelected, or if somebody else on the Democratic side is elected in November, to see some significant changes. On the other hand, a lot of the recently appointed justices on the Republican side, they are young, and even John Roberts is not that old. So it seems quite consequential, probably more so than in the past, because people are more aware of it than they were before.
Tiffany, one of the big issues over the last several years, especially with the Biden administration, is foreign policy. How much does our foreign policy and what we engage in and what we fund and what we ignore, how much do you think foreign policy and NATO will play in this year's election?
It's going to play major, which could hurt Biden, which a lot of Democrats have spoke out about that. I will say it plain and simple. We have a lot of issues right here in America that we could be dealing with, but it seems as if we're so focused on the outside that we don't take care of home. I was always taught that you take care of home first. So when we think about NATO, when we think about foreign policy, that's going to be huge in this election. A lot of people don't feel that President Biden's words, his actions are aligning with his words, right? And so when you have that problem, you lose faith in the voters. And so it makes me scared that Biden could lose some support, or B, people just simply won't go out and vote, because people will say, it really doesn't matter. We're doomed anyway, whether we have Biden or whether we have Trump.
This is your voice, your future, and we're covering the issues that I think that you care about. When we return, Nathan and I are going to talk about what impact does trade have on this election. I'm Armstrong Williams. This is your voice and your future, and we'll be back.
As a home buyer, you need a lender who cares about your home ownership dreams. United Security Financial has been helping families secure their dream homes for 30 years. We're a national fair practice lender that provides affordable mortgages and low down payment programs to eligible home buyers. To learn how United Security Financial can help you secure your dream home, call 1-800-373-4186.
You know, Trump is pushing a 10% across the board tariff on all imports. He says, Nathan, it could go as high as 60%. Trade.
Yeah. It is remarkable to see that. What I would argue is that the broader Trump philosophy on trade has, as with so many other aspects of the Trump platform, despite what people on both ends of the political spectrum might want to say, completely upended the way Americans think about this issue. As I was pointing out earlier, despite the fact that, for example, the Democratic platform in 2020 was opposed to the notion of what they characterized as a trade war with China, subsequently they have continued the trade measures, most of the trade measures from Trump, and they've, of course, imposed new tariffs under Section 301 targeting aluminum, steel, solar panels, as well as electric vehicles, with the view of, this is, an argument that many proponents of tariffs will make, trying to build up these industries in the United States. Of course, one important point when it comes to these tariffs with China and with other countries, but in particular China, is that we have developed many of these technologies, and through what you could, generously call close observation, maybe also call intellectual property theft, China has managed to basically gain an advantage in some areas, for example, in a number of key military-related technologies. There was one recent report that I believe had said that out of something like 42 or 44 important technologies, China has an advantage in something like 35. I'm spitballing those figures, but anyway, you look at this big picture, and it's not a surprise that in some respects you've seen a continuation of this from Biden. So when Trump says that he's imposing this tariff, it rings differently than it did a few years ago. I would also add, though, that there's some important differences philosophically between the two administrations. You have more of a support for direct subsidies, I think, across the board, including for EVs. On the Biden side, more of a de registe approach, I suppose, and more of a support for tariffs, including across-the-board tariffs on the Trump side. Depending upon the economist you talk to, some will argue that the Trump tariffs were ineffective, that they essentially cost consumers a lot. On the other hand, there's at least one Federal Reserve economist with whom my colleague has spoken who argued just the opposite, that the broader tariffs in the case of what Trump did a better job of promoting industry. You could perhaps argue that the broader the tariff, less likely to end up just playing favorites with industry and with big donors, which is, of course, always a concern with any sort of move towards protectionism.
Tiffany, you have your fingers on the pulse of a lot of things that goes on in this country. What are the issues that we're not speaking about enough that will impact the outcome of this election and how people vote that are underreported?
That's a good question. First of all, I think that a lot of people, especially when you hear a lot of college students, I think racism is going to is going to be an impact with that. I think police brutality, when you look at college students, hear the voices of college students, they talk about police brutality, we're still seeing an issue with that. And I really just think it's really just not being able to trust. People have just lost faith in the government, and they want a candidate where they can have trust in. There are people that are still concerned that we have a potential president, former President Trump, that could be the president again, that is a felon, and people are concerned about that. I think that, and I also think about the recent protests. I think that people want more about that. Also, let me also say, here in Texas, we've had over the past couple of weeks like 6 school shootings, and I think people want to hear more about what is each candidate going to do when we hear about school shootings. What are we going to do to minimize that? And so what are we going to do to protect our children? Because no parent should have the anxiety of sending their child to school and worry about if they're going to get a phone call or look on the news that there's been a school shooting at their school and their child could potentially be in danger. Just in Arlington, Texas, a few weeks ago, these 2 young men got into an argument. The young man went to his car, came back, and shot and killed the young man at the school. These kids are traumatized. And so that is one of the major things that a lot of people are not really focusing on, are school shootings and mental health. We don't talk about it enough. We just think that you can just have these programs out there and that's enough. We have to do more, especially for our young kids with mental health. We're starting to see more and more young people commit suicide, whether it's at the hands of bullying, whether they're living in poverty, racism, or what have you. So when I think about the things that we're really not talking about, I would say school shootings and mental health are at the top of my list.
Nathan, underreported stories that could have a huge impact on this election.
The issues?
Any issue that you feel that's going to have an impact that we in the media don't discuss enough, as Tiffany just laid out, these hidden issues which she thinks that has young people concerned, up in arms, kids shooting each other, the suicide, the mental illness. These are important issues. Well, let me ask you this.
Yeah.
Let me help you out here, okay? Go ahead.
On the gun issue, you speak with some people. For example, I spoke with Tyler Boyer of Turning Point Action in Arizona, which is a conservative group. He was arguing that at least in that state, the gun issue, that tends to favor Republicans, at least right now. And of course, a lot of that has to do with the media environment. For example, if there's I would pray this does not happen, but a very high-profile shooting that gets lots and lots of media coverage right before the election, and some of this is the media deciding to concentrate on an incident for whatever reason. In that event, it might become more salient to voters. I think that, these questions of why people are so despairing, and it is one that you see people on all sides politically talk about: the rise in suicides, the rise in what Nobel Prize-winning economist Angus Deaton described as deaths of despair. This is something that crosses lines of gender and race and class. A lot of people would look at that and think that there's a crisis in meaning, and that politics it's not so easy to find a political solution in some of those cases. But the one crisis that I think gets talked about but maybe not enough is that of fertility, which you look at the United States, countries across the world, people are not marrying, people are not having kids at the same rate as they were, including in countries that up until very recently had a very high, above replacement fertility rate. And this matters because it suggests that a lot of people are not as hopeful about the future. Or it could also just be that people are so affluent that they no longer see the rationale for marriage. But if a politician or a political party can, and this is probably one of the hardest problems in politics, find a way to address that and actually come up with a message, with a policy, with something, that would be hugely significant. But some of these problems are just hard to reduce to politics.
Tiffany, when you think about the division in this country, the lack of civility, and then you watched your congressman, where you are, Jasmine Crockett, and AOC, and Marjorie Taylor Greene, who, in her immature way, talking about someone's eyelashes, a personal attack. What happens when young people, they see it devolve at this level? I mean, this is what you expect from immature, spoiled kids, not from our leaders, our representatives, our members of Congress. What does it say about where our country is going?
I think that we're more focused on popularity than humanity. We're more focused on clickbait, who's going viral, rather than serving the American people. What we saw happen in Congress on Friday should have never happened. People are attacking Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett for what she said. Let's be clear. She never called Marjorie Taylor Greene's name. She raised the question that because Comer refused to to strike down the words initially and said that Marjorie Taylor Greene was not out of order. Jasmine Crockett was not bothering anyone. Marjorie Taylor Greene was totally out of order for saying, for pointing at her eyelashes and saying, well, maybe you can't read because of your eyelashes. That is what I call ghetto. That is what I call behaving in a low-class manner. And then when we're going back and forth, tit for tat, you raise the question, what is this showing? I don't think that it is showing a good image for our children, because we can't expect our children to be great if we're not being great. But I will say this. Everyone knows, Armstrong, that you don't attack a woman's looks. And you don't, especially a Black woman, you don't in a public environment try to humiliate and embarrass a Black woman, especially when you are attacking her looks. Marjorie Taylor Greene is not a good representation for America. This is a woman who has said that Black people should be proud when they see Confederate monuments, because it should show how far we have come from slavery. This is a woman who has said some of the most ridiculous things, that have said Muslims don't belong in government, that have said that Black people are held slaves to Democrats. Now, when we talk about ghetto, I think that Marjorie Taylor Greene is the poster child for that, because she had no right. Now, am I condoning about saying baby girl and going back and forth and saying beach blonde, bad built, butch body? No, I'm not condoning that. But what I am saying is that every now and then it is time for people to speak up, because Marjorie Taylor Greene thinks that she can say whatever it is that she wants to say, and people are supposed to be so afraid of her because she's Marjorie Taylor Greene, and she feels that who do you think you are? Who do you think you are that you can say whatever that it is that you want to say, and you don't think that Jasmine has a right, Congressman Crockett has a right to defend herself? Now, again, Armstrong, I'm not defending, and I am not.
Tiffany, I think everybody understands what you're saying. I think you're clear. Thank you all for joining us for this edition of Your Voice, Your Future. I'm Armstrong Williams.